Well, hello everyone. This is Bishop Bryan coming to you live from Ackworth, Georgia on this November 17th, 2015 for Vestiges of Christianity. Today we continue last week's episode on Purgatory, Limbo, and Ghosts. This is part 2. What happens to us after we die? It's the biggest question of all, perhaps. You might even be a little skeptical about the things I am going to share with you on this episode, and I don't expect a great deal of you to appreciate me after I am done revealing to you what I am about to reveal to you. It's a difficult, challenging subject to be sure, but I have never been one to handle things delicately. Bear with me, and you might learn something. Stay tuned. It's going to be one amazing ride. Once again, I want to thank all of you for joining me today for this episode of Vestiges of Christianity. Once again, I am Bishop Bryan of the Holy Nicholean Catholic Church, its presiding bishop and patriarch. For those of you new to this show, the Holy Nicholean Catholic Church is an esoteric Catholic church, which allows us the ability to dive quite a bit deeper into the theology of Catholicism and mystical spirituality, where the direct experience with God is to be found. Not at the surface level, not in the spiritual kindergarten of the conventional church systems, but behind the cloister, deep within the recesses of the monasteries, contemplative Christianity, where the heart of spirituality, Christianity, and Christ is to be found. Well, last week I gave you quite a beginning into this subject. I'm not sure how any of you felt. I didn't get too much feedback. Got a few likes, though, on Facebook, so that's interesting. Today it's going to be more of a challenge for you, particularly those of you who are more of a traditional Christian, traditional Catholic. This is not going to be easy for you to stomach. So I ask you to bear with me. Get to the end of the episode. And don't make the mistake that so many people do today in our modern world, where everyone thinks they have to agree with everything. And we have this little fail-safe little game that we play with ourselves, where if we can choose not to agree with something, then for some reason we tend to think that alone makes it false. Oh, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And so we immediately dismiss the content as being wrong. I want to set the record very straight right now. What I am sharing with you, what I'm about to share with you about the process of the afterlife, death and dying, is not something from my own bias or worldview, some personal philosophy that I've decided to concoct. It's not anything to do with my having syncretic biases. No. In fact, in a lot of ways, I would almost wish that some of what I'm about to share with you was not true. What I am giving you is the data points that I have observed and studied for many years as a paranormal investigator, as an exorcist bishop, and as an aspirant on the mystical path. As someone who has engaged contemplative Christianity, who has lived behind the cloister of monasteries, and has spent a great deal of time at the altar of God, deep in prayer, for many years, for sometimes hours upon hours each day. I try in my spiritual work, in the methodologies that we practice within our church, I work very, very hard to not become attached to the things that I see, so that when I make a mystical observation, I can just take it for face value. I can just simply say, this is what was observed. Doesn't mean I like it, doesn't mean I agree with it, doesn't mean I even want to believe in it, because I don't put my own personal beliefs or the beliefs of anyone into these observations. I just simply make the observation. And that's important, because if we don't do those things, we can sometimes impress upon the observations a contaminated worldview, what we wish were true versus what is true. So what I'm about to share with you here about the afterlife has nothing to do with what I want. It has everything to do with the observations that were made by myself, by those who practice mystical observation along with me, by the various mystical teachers that I have encountered over the course of my life, the various programs that I've been a part of, and the work that I do. This is what has been compiled as the most reasonable worldview, the most reasonable explanation. It's not necessarily complete, but I will tell you that it is quite accurate. So whether you like it or not, this is what we're dealing with. And I'm going to give you a little bit of information as to how to reconcile it within yourself. Because in some places it might appear on the surface to contradict good Christian or Catholic theology. Okay? So that being said, let's move forward. Now, I already gave you a little hint about what's coming here today, last week on the previous episode of the show. We talked a little bit about purgatory, limbo, heaven and hell, and we talked a little bit about the three states of being, which is body, spirit, and soul. And we kind of left off at the best part, and we ran out of time, and so that's why we're having this part 2 to kind of pick up where we left off. So now you're going to get the real meat of the subject, which is going to be both very interesting and likely very disturbing for some of you. So it seems as though within the ancient theology of Christianity, there is to be found 4 states or conditions, not places. Heaven and hell, purgatory and limbo are not locations. They're not places you go. These are misnomers, just the inadequacy of the English language, or every language, human communication, to really relay accurate information about the nature of things. A better word than place, a lot better word than place, would be condition. These are conditions. Purgatory, limbo, heaven, hell, these are things that happen, not places you go. These are things that happen to you. And they're not what we think they are. They have been embellished with colorful archetypal, fictitious storylines. The idea, Dante's Inferno, the idea of all these layers of hell and all these different types of suffering for the different types of sin that man and woman can commit. Purgatory. We've talked about what limbo is last time, and of course we all think we know what heaven is, this beatific vision, this union with God, which is all very true. But the idea of giving it the status of a place or location is problematic. It doesn't have these properties. These are states. These are conditions. So it's important to keep in mind before we go any further, because you have to understand the semantics of what we're dealing with. There's, to a certain extent, a new vocabulary that is required to fully understand this. And before we go on, I also want to say, I forgot to mention it at the beginning of the show, we have a chat room. So if there's questions along the way and you are listening live, by all means, interject a message or a question or a comment into the chat room. and that's on the Spreaker page. You should be able to access it, but you might have to log in or create a Spreaker account to do it, which you should. And you should follow the show. That way you'll always know when I'm broadcasting, since I don't have yet a regular schedule. But you can ask questions that way, and I'll answer them if they're good questions or if they're relevant. And also tell me if I'm having sound issues, because if I can't hear my broadcast until after it's been aired. So if there is a problem, I need to hear from my audience. I don't have an engineer. I do this all myself. So keep that in mind. Okay. Death and dying. Well, how do we know what happens? How do we know what determines purgatory, limbo, heaven, hell? Now, we talked a little bit about what happens with limbo, that was the church's answer to what happens to unbaptized babies who don't have the grace of the purification properties of baptism from original sin, so they can't enter into the kingdom of heaven. But yet they certainly are not evil enough to go to hell. So we have this limbo condition, this sort of, very much like Sheol or Hades. We talked all about that last time. If you didn't listen to that show, go listen to that one first before you really get into this one, because you're going to need that prerequisite information. All right, now, how do we know what happens? How do we avoid things like limbo and purgatory and hell and get right to where we want to go? Again, see the language, the inadequacies of language. It still sounds like a place. How do we end up with the condition of heaven? Well, there's three things that we can do to ourselves that determine this. Okay? There's three conditions. Also, just like the conditions of afterlife, there's three living states, three living conditions that we could be in at the point of death, which help to determine these outcomes. The first is dying outside of the state of grace. Now, this would be both relevant to somebody who has not received the sacrament of baptism, but it also could be someone who has, but who has not purified themselves of their sins that they committed after baptism. This is once again where the sacrament of reconciliation and the sacrament of the sick or extreme unction is essential to the dying process, because this is a way that we can assure that we die within a state of grace. And remember what we mean by grace. Grace is the gift that God gives us that makes His salvation possible. Okay? It's not enough that Christ died for our sins. That's just the first step. We have to accept what He did. Otherwise, it doesn't work. It's not an automatic condition. It's only enough as long as we accept Christ into our lives. And that is done through grace. Okay? So dying outside of grace would be not having active in your life those graces of salvation that make salvation possible. That's where the limbo hell thing plays a part. Now, I'm going to really simplify it, because we're going to actually take it beyond the theology, which I already mentioned is archetypal, and it's a lot of colorful stories that sort of give us an impression as to what these conditions are like. But in actuality, they're a little bit different than what the church has taught. We have to understand the biblical theology and really to get into the basis of what things like purgatory, limbo, and hell are. And so when we die outside of a state of grace, well, let me give you the other states. There's dying outside the state of grace, there's dying within a state of grace, and then there's dying in a state of epinosis. And you're going to be like, what? Epinosis. That is the highest state. That is skillful, what I like to call skillful dying. It is not just enough to have the grace of God, but it's to have cultivated the faculties of awareness to an extent that we can actually apply the grace effectively to assure the best outcome for us. Okay? So those are the three conditions that can happen in life. But now let's talk about the reality of the four conditions that the church teaches: purgatory, limbo, heaven, and hell. Well, let me tell you the first thing right off the bat. There's not a lot of difference between limbo and hell. And I'm going to even go as far as to say hell is really not the place of torment that we have been taught it is. And that is actually biblical in a lot of ways. So that you're going to say, well, wait a second, Jesus said certain things. Well, yeah, he did. But let me give you a little bit of a background here. Mostly in the gospel according to Matthew, but we see it also in Mark and Luke as well. Jesus refers to hell as Gehenna. Now, that word Gehenna is based upon a actual location outside of the city walls of Jerusalem called the Valley of Hinnom, and that was a traditional place, traditionally understood to be a place where the trash of the city was burned, destroyed, and it would be this place where they had fires always running, always burning, and that would be where the people of the city of Jerusalem would take their trash to get rid of it. It was like an incinerator plant, only primitive, and it was known as Gehenna. Now, some people have theorized that the Gehenna really didn't exist. There wasn't really a place where they burnt with fires, had fires burning all the time. But it was enough of a Jewish tradition for Jesus to actually refer to it this way. It goes back to some Old Testament things. There was some, little legends about the place where they used to sacrifice children in these spots. So it was considered a dark place, a place of the damned, and certainly it was understood that not only trash was put there, but corpses of criminals were thrown in there, and deprived of a proper burial. They were just cremated, incinerated in the trash dump, and that was considered to be the fires of Gehenna, which Jesus equated in a lot of places in the book, in the Gospel according to Matthew, as his metaphor for hell. Okay, and he even refers to it as a pretty horrible thing. He would say, "It is better for you that one of the parts of your body perish than for your whole body to be thrown into Gehenna." It's definitely something that he sees to be avoided. He even says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites," because he goes on and on and on, and then he eventually says, "Twice as much a child of Gehenna as yourselves." He is. He'll say in Matthew 23:33. That's my favorite one. He says to the Pharisees, "You serpents, you brood of vipers, how shall you to escape the sentence of Gehenna?" It's referred to as a sentence, a punishment. This is all metaphor. These are not actualities. These are spiritual metaphors, because there is no way to convey the condition of hell in the language of the people of Jesus' time. And so he refers to it the way that he does, so that people can have some basic understanding that this is a condition that you want to avoid. So think about it from a literal standpoint. I'm going to give you permission, and I'm usually against literalism in scriptural interpretation, but in this case it actually makes sense to do so. Think about literally. If Jesus was using Gehenna as a metaphor, what would the literal implications be? Does the corpses of criminals burning in a trash dump, do they really suffer? Does trash suffer when you burn it? Or is it just a place that you get rid of things that are no longer useful? Well, in a lot of ways, that's kind of what, I hate to say it, from an esoteric Christian perspective, which is a challenge for a lot of conventional, traditional Christians. This is what Jesus is ultimately saying. Okay, the sentence of hell, fires of Gehenna, the sentence of Gehenna is not this place where you go to be tormented for all eternity, but rather a place where you go to be annihilated. And again, here I go again with saying it's a place. I'm trying to use the metaphor of it being a place, but in actuality it is condition. It is the condition of being annihilated, removed. And I've even had some liberal bishops say, this subject came up a little while ago, and a bishop once said, more on the liberal side of Catholicism, said, "Oh, I don't believe in hell. I don't believe in an annihilation because energy cannot be created or destroyed." They start to play that thermodynamics card, the laws of thermodynamics, and unfortunately, when we're talking about energy, that doesn't necessarily mean we're talking about cohesion. Yes, energy, as far as we know, cannot be destroyed, but that doesn't mean the cohesion of that energy can't be eradicated. What makes you a person, what makes you a human being, is a combination of multiple symbioses, right? I mean, you have to have everything working just exactly right in order for you to exist as a person. One of those things goes wrong, one of those things falls out of balance, and then you can face death. And the energy that makes up our awareness, our consciousness, can break down. Yeah, the energy might go and be scattered throughout the universe, but it's no longer cohesive in the form that would produce consciousness or self or an identity as we know it. And so therefore, yes, the identity of ourselves can be very quickly dismantled. In fact, there really isn't much of it to maintain in the first place. And we have to get a little bit into Buddhism to understand that aspect of it, because in Christianity, in the Western world, we're very used to understanding ourselves as being an individual, an identity that's important, that we are loved by God as who we are. And there is truth to that. Yes, I'm not disputing it, but our notions of self are very different than how God sees us. And in order to really develop our relationship to God in a way that is going to be effective for purposes of salvation, we need to understand how God sees us, not how we want God to see us, and not how we see ourselves. So when we're looking at the idea of hell and limbo, Hades, think about what Hades was. Think about what we talked about last time with Sheol, even Yomi in Shinto. This was what the afterlife naturally is. The natural condition. No grace, nothing to help you after death. Just simply dying, the natural process of death. The body goes, and then it immediately begins the process of decomposition, and then the spirit, our non-corporeal side. The body's the corporeal side, the physical side. The spirit is the non-corporeal side, the non-physical aspect of ourselves. Because everything in the universe is corporeal and non-corporeal. Everything has a side. The non-corporeal is what trips up science, because they're only looking at corporeal things. The universe is mostly non-corporeal. I hate to say it. So they're missing out on the majority of the universe. That's where philosophy and religion come in and are very useful to us. So when we're talking about the spirit, at death, the spirit eventually starts to break down because it no longer has its connection to the vital forces that kept it alive and kept it cohesive. So the energy gets scattered, breaks down. Okay? That energy, without any cohesive grace from the sacrifice of the cross, to use Christian theological terms, just dissipates. It slowly just breaks down into nothing. And yes, you're wondering about the punishment. Why is Jesus so adamant that it's suffering, that hell equates to suffering? Well, because it is actually quite terrifying to watch yourself decompose. To watch your body when you're maybe not even fully aware of what happened to you. You might even not know that you're dead. This is what ghosts are, my friends. Hate to say it. These are what hauntings are. People don't like to accept these aspects of it. They want to write them off as demons. I'm sorry. Most of the time, they are not demons. Most of the time, they are people who have died without grace. And so this happens. And you think, well, why doesn't God do something? Well, he did do something. He gave to you the grace of the church. You rejected it. And I see it all the time. Now, you're going to say, well, what about other religions? Well, yeah, other religions have within their systems, their own systems, access to these same grace points They don't use those terms like we do. But actually, valid religions have all of the same sacramental forms that produce the same results. But in the West, the best one by far is Christianity. It's the easiest system of all systems because you have the divine actually interacting with you in the personhood of Jesus, who is both man and God. Two persons in one. And as we talked about with theosis, God becomes man so that man can become God. God dies. He sacrifices himself so that his divine life can be imparted to you, because without it, you don't have access to that. You don't have access to his immortality. He needs to shed his own nature so that you can consume it. And for Catholics and Orthodox, we take this in the form of the Eucharist, the body and blood of Christ, which mystically contains the essence of the divine, the immortality of the divine, which makes soteriology possible. Soteriology being the theology of salvation, for those of you who aren't familiar with that term. Okay, so dying outside of the grace of Christ in the Christian context, we're only going to deal with that. This is Vestiges of Christianity after all. I don't need to explain how every religion does this. But for Christians, it's rejecting the baptismal sacrament and rejecting the restorative sacraments of Eucharist and reconciliation. And to a certain extent, this unction as well. Dying outside of God's grace. God did do something. You rejected it. And so therefore the consequences are the consequences. You don't want God's grace? Then fine. He's not going to force it upon you. He's not going to punish you, even though it seems like a sentence. It is a sentence. It's a sentence you inflict upon yourself. You become your own judge. You, by judging Christianity and rejecting its graces, you have judged yourself. God doesn't send you to hell. You send yourself there. And so therefore, limbo and hell become one and the same thing. It is the condition of the spirit decomposing until it becomes nothing, until it's just simply eradicated. In the same sense that ancient Judaism understood Sheol. So that gets rid of a couple of conditions. Okay? That's important because we want to pay very close attention to these terms. Now, we can say limbo is limbo. It's a little bit better than saying babies go to hell, but the outcome is the same. There might not be as much suffering with limbo, actually, because a baby doesn't really have the faculties of awareness that a fully grown adult would. So it is very likely that the hell experience of decomposition of a spirit is less traumatic to a baby than it is for an adult who has lived a full life and has grown attached to to his or her existence. Okay, so limbo and hell, one and the same thing. The condition of the spirit decomposing until it is eradicated from the cosmos and becomes nothing. What happens to that energy? All that energy, remember the people, that bishop that says, oh no, I don't believe in hell because I don't believe in annihilation because energy can't be created or destroyed. Well, yeah, the energy goes on. Believe it or not, it gets recycled. The cosmos recycles it. It's an efficient machine. Creation is an efficient machine. God wastes nothing. And so therefore, the energy that once made up that person gets recycled into the cosmos and then eventually respawns at some point and becomes a new person. This we call reincarnation. Now, Christians don't have any theology of reincarnation anymore. They never really did. There was a few that speculated in the very, very early stages of Christianity, but it was quickly stifled. In fact, those that did talk about reincarnation were actually condemned for a long time by the church. So the church doesn't like this term. But it is a reality. It's not something that we can dismiss that easily. It's just not what we think it is. And even in Buddhism and even in Hinduism and religions that have a doctrine of reincarnation, we see that it's not the reincarnation of the New Age movement. It's not this idea where, oh, you die and you make choices and you learn life lessons and then you choose if you want to come back and you choose your parents and you're no. No. That's not reincarnation. That never was reincarnation. That is not reincarnation for Buddhists. That is not reincarnation for Hindus. And it's certainly not reincarnation for any esoteric Catholic or Christian who understands these things. Okay? The person that you are, what you see yourself as, who you see as your identity, your sense of self, has one life, just like Christianity teaches. You get that one chance. And that's it. Your energy gets recycled. So some of that energy can contain the footprints, the imprints of lives that it has helped to support. In Buddhism, that energy is called the alaya. But what it is really is just the energy patterns that maintain just a little bit of cohesion, just enough to have imprints on them. So if you were like a very compassionate, loving person, that compassion and love is eternal. It's not you anymore. It gets recycled into a new person. And they take on those qualities into themselves. And then when they are born with the qualities that you once possessed, they become their qualities. That new person adopts them. And those qualities we call in esoteric mysticism aggregates. They are the impersonal components that make up a sense of self. When combined with consciousness and a brain, and we can look at ourselves and say, oh, we exist. And who are we? Well, we might describe ourselves certain ways. Well, those descriptions become our aggregates. And if we do not have the grace of God when we die, there's nothing to hold those aggregates together. So they just get scattered and then recycled, because qualities like love and compassion are eternal. Nothing can destroy them. They become qualities that make up the cosmos itself. They're part of the creation. They're eternal qualities. They're archetypal in nature. And so they exist forever. But you do not. You will break down. If you don't preserve yourself through the grace of Christ, which is what Christians call salvation, then you just simply eradicated, and your sense of self goes away, but your aggregates remain for someone else to pick up. Likewise, if you were a terribly evil and mean person, that can actually become the aggregates of a new person as well. It's part of the reason why we should not strive to be evil, because what you do is perpetuate evil. So yes, when you die, your evil gets recycled into some other poor soul, not soul in the spiritual sense, soul in the person sense, and now they have to deal with everything you dealt with. So your evil continues on. This is what Buddhists would loosely call the forces of karma. Okay? I hope this is making sense to you, and I hope it's not too disturbing to you. But understand it this way. So obviously you're going to want to avoid limbo and hell. Everyone wants to avoid annihilation, and the whole foundation to Christianity is eternal life. That's what Jesus promises us. So how do we avoid this? And what is this, what about this reincarnation thing? Well, what happens if you die in a state of grace? This is where that thing that we talked about before, last time, about purgatory. How do we end up in purgatory? Well, remember we said people who are not perfectly purified cannot enter into heaven. You must be absolutely pure to enter into the beatific vision of God and become one with Him. You must be absolutely perfect. And if you don't die in perfect grace, then you will not be able to go into heaven. But likewise, you've got so much grace that you're not able to be dismantled in limbo or hell. So then, therefore, there's that alternative condition we call purgatory. And it's always been understood metaphorically within the church as this purifying, this place where you're purified by fire. There is suffering, they would say. Well, guess what? What purgatory is? Guess what? If you die in a state of grace, if you have enough of that grace active in your life, then enough of you can last. Enough of you will outlast death. And so therefore, when your aggregates get scattered at the point of the natural breakdown of the body and spirit, the natural decomposition, enough of those qualities, those aggregates, are preserved within what we understand to be the soul. That is the only eternal part of us. And guess what? We don't have souls. Souls have us. And so there's another thing when people say, well, you can't have reincarnation because look at there's so much more people. Where are all these new souls coming from? Well, it's very easy. The reason that it looks like new souls are being created all the time is because we don't actually have individual souls. We are part of soul families. Have you ever met someone where you have this instant connection with them? Maybe it was just like love at first sight and you couldn't bear to live without them. We call that like soulmates. And sometimes soulmates are not necessarily, romantic interests. They can sometimes be family members, brothers and sisters. And this happens. Ever meet someone where you don't know why you have this instant connection, but you do? That's because you share a similar soul family. Part of your soul is actually part of their soul. Souls can animate multiple bodies and spirits. And that's what a soul is. It's what animates us. It's what gives us life. It's where the fundamental awareness that we all possess comes from. That's the soul. And so if you are dying in a state of grace, while you can't do anything about your body being decomposed, and you can't do anything about your spirit being decomposed, enough of your aggregations that made up a sense of identity can be preserved within that soul. When those aggregates get scattered and respawn into a new person, enough of that person might just be enough of you. That process is ultimately what purgatory is. And I know, oh my goodness, I can just hear the hate mail coming in now with all the traditional Catholics saying, why are you telling us that purgatory is reincarnation? Well, you can go with the metaphorical stories that the church has taught. Those are fine. They're adequate. I have nothing against them. But what I'm giving you here today is mystical actuality. This is what we have observed. This is what we have seen. I don't necessarily like it any more than you do, but this is the way it is. And we can deal with things the way they are, or we can deal with things the way we wish they were. And let me tell you, it's not in our best interest to handle this the way we wish things were. Okay? So yes, that's purgatory. It is when you have enough grace to retain some cohesion, some sense of permanence, not perfect permanence, just enough, that it gets purified through the process of death and rebirth, while the rest of it gets eradicated because it's not useful, just like Gehenna. Trash dump, get rid of the trash. So now you're going to say, well, I don't want to even to deal with the reincarnation thing anymore. I don't want to go to purgatory. Let's say you accept everything I'm telling you. And you probably are not, but let's say you are. Let's say you're using a little bit of wisdom, enough of an open mind, and you're willing to trust my perspective, my contentions here, which are very, very sound. Let's say you want to avoid this purgatory. You want to avoid limbo and hell, clearly. You want permanence. You want to be one with God. You want to, quote unquote, go to heaven. That's where the third life condition is necessary. And that is dying in a state of epignosis. What's epignosis? Well, that's you probably know the word gnosis, which, means knowledge. And you've heard of the Gnostics, the Christian heresy. where knowledge was emphasized. That's the foundation of Nicholean soteriology. In the Protestant Christianity, we have that faith, salvation is achieved through faith alone. Sola fide. In Catholicism and Orthodoxy, and in ancient Christianity, it's always been taught that salvation is achieved through faith. St. Paul was right. But for good works. St. James was right as well. They're both right. Salvation is achieved through faith for good works. If you don't perform the good works, then you're really not exhibiting the faith. And so that's why St. James says faith without works is dead, because it is dead, and it leads to death. It's eradicated by the universe and its recycling program that God created as part of his creation, so that nothing is wasted, and everything eventually comes to a state of perfection. So next time, it looks like we're going to have a part 3 here. Next time we will discuss what epignosis is and why the Nicholean Church teaches that salvation is achieved through faith for good works by epignosis. And I know that's rough stuff. This whole show is rough stuff for you poor traditionalists. Oh, I do apologize. I don't mean to be shaking up your worldview. And I know a lot of you are like, what kind of bishop would talk like this? And I'm going to get the thumbs down on YouTube. Everything gets archived to YouTube, and I get a lot of thumbs down. You don't need to do that. I don't really worry about it. I know it's not going to be pleasing to you to hear these things, but I am sharing them with you for those among you who are ready to take the next step out of the spiritual kindergarten of the conventional church and are ready to enter into a more mature understanding of the divine life, a more mature relationship to God, the direct experience. That's what it's all about. And so in part 3 of Purgatory, Limbo, and Ghosts, we will discuss how salvation is achieved through faith for good works by epignosis, thus leading to the kingdom of heaven. Yes, it is possible. Christ opened the doors to eternal life. All we need do is step through. Sounds easy enough, but not necessarily as easy as it might seem. I'll show you how it's done. I will give you everything you need to be able to engage that reality. And it is absolutely Christian in every sense. There is nothing heretical here. It's only semantics that would make it seem so. Don't fall into that trap. Be smarter than that. You're going to need to be able to engage the mystical life any further. Until next time, everyone, this is Bishop Bryan for Vestiges of Christianity. Take care.